So I wanted to just start a little bit talking about why I chose the book Emergent Strategy to think through as a frame. And I think one of the amazing things about this book, which is, as you read it, is written, it's a very nonlinear book, meaning you could pick any chapter and start it there, right? And then move backwards, move forwards. It's a real demonstration of what she is trying to encourage us to practice in our approach to addressing serious things that we need to change. She's using a lot of ideas that she has taken from science fiction. It is kind of cracking me up that folks are taking notes right now, because I feel like we haven't gotten there yet. But this is, if I'm saying anything interesting, feel free. So she's using a lot of ideas that she has taken from science fiction writers, and she is actually trying to reframe science fiction as social justice organizing, because it is a way to think about a future that doesn't exist yet, and what kind of future we would want, or potentially warn us about what the future will hold if we don't change what we're doing today, right? So can anybody think of an example of a science fiction or a fantasy book that envisions a different kind of future? Yeah.
Hunger Games.
Hunger Games, okay. What do you think Hunger Games says about the current moment that we are in right now?
There's a lot of fertile ground for things to go wrong.
Okay, all right, yeah, yeah.
Harry Potter.
Sure.
Basically, like, bigoted Death Eaters.
Uh-huh.
The whole movement where they take power, and then a grassroots movement when the, I guess, white moderate liberal of today was like, whoa, I can't just like be okay with order alone.
Uh-huh.
Push back.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Do you robot stream of Electric Sheep?
Oh, what's that? I don't know that one.
It's like what movie Blade Runner was premised on.
You got a fan over here.
It's pretty much warning us about like artificial intelligence.
Okay.
So,
All right.
society.
All right, so think about what might happen if we
Yeah.
don't think critically about artificial intelligence. Yeah. Orkin Crake. Yeah, I haven't read that one. Do you want to?
Yeah, it's just learning about dangers of genetic editing.
Okay.
To the
Yeah.
humans products.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know much this one relates, but Wally.
Okay. What's the future in WALL-E? What is it warning or helping us to envision?
That technology can like get the best of us and just make us like kind of turn into like lazy people out of that.
Okay. Great.
Yes.
Yeah. These are all fantastic answers. And so I just want to ask, has anyone here read any Octavia Butler? Yeah. Parable of the Sower? No? Okay.
Kindred?
For fans of science fiction and fantasy, it just doesn't get any better. Just an incredibly visionary writer. So Adrienne Maree Brown in the book Emergent Strategy is looking at some of Octavia Butler's writings and asking, what can I learn about the present moment I am in right now from these visions of the future that she has proposed, either as warnings or as an ideal that we may aspire to, right? And she's particularly looking at the book Parable of the Sower, which in Butler's vision takes place soon after the fall of capitalism. And the first chapter, I will say, is one of the most terrifying visions, but I think the reason that it is terrifying is that it seems so possible that of something that could happen in the very near future.
As possible as Handmaid's Tale?
More, I would say more possible.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I think Handmaid's
I used
Tale
to work
fails
in the Handmaid's Tale movement. Like,
What's the Handmaid's Tale movement?
well, I mean, like, so to give you a sense of what I mean by this, right? Y'all know, y'all seen Handmaid's Tale, right?
The TV
No,
show
the
or
TV
read
show.
the book?
You read it? Yeah, okay,
Uh-huh.
all right.
Yeah.
So basically, the United States has stopped having children, or the world has stopped having children. The religious right has said the reason for this is because God is upset about our gender equality, and we and they clap back by making women into categories all based around producing children, right? And handmaids in particular borrows from the biblical language of a secondary wife to produce children. Mm-hmm. And I point out, like, I used to work, when I say I used to work in the handmaid movement, I'm referring to the far right of white evangelicalism that I used to work in. To give you an example, the pastor that I served with had 11 children by the time I left, maybe 13 or 14 now, and was part of a movement called the Quiverful Movement. Quiverful Movement is a movement of white evangelicals who have as many children as they can. They refer to them as the arrows in your quiver, because the children are weapons to move the country politically back into right male, female, and other visions of what our sex roles should be. And so I like to point out with my classes that my pastor's family could outvote most of my classes, right? If every single one of us voted and every single one of them voted, we would lose, right? And that's just one. And, you know, like, and that's part of an enormous movement that you don't even see, right? That is incredibly well organized. Anyway, that's why practicality, I'm like, these things are already happening.
Oh, absolutely.
They're not just fantasy.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's an important point, right?
Which I was going to say 1984 when you first said that,
Yeah.
but I was like, but we're there. So
Yeah.
it's
Right, right. We were like, oh yeah, 1984, take
No,
this
it
from
was
2019.
2019.
Yeah. All right. So in Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Marie Brown is thinking through some of these science fiction stories and what we can learn about the present moment from them. And in Parable of the Sower, a leader emerges who begins to build a movement that is based around some core principles. And one of the most important principles that she embraces in the movement that she builds is change. She talks about God as change, and change. Everything we touch changes, right? Everything we touch changes, and everything we touch changes us. That's what it is. So she's thinking about this as an organizing principle, right? And so Emergent Strategy is Adrienne Marie Brown thinking about social movements in the United States and how they can use this as a strategy to move us forward. And so she's thinking about embracing change and how we must embrace change or we are going to become irrelevant. That in order to move forward, in order to escape from the oppressive systems that we're trapped within, we have to embrace change as a constant state, right? So rejecting the status quo in favor of being open to new possibilities. Yeah?
What oppressive systems does she talk about in the book?
She talks about a whole lot of them. So she talks a lot about race, talks a lot about anti-blackness, talks about other forms of racism. She talks about the gender binary. She talks quite a bit about poverty and class, wealth inequality. So I think and in the workshops that I've been to with her, where she's talking about putting this into practice, she's trying to make room for all of us to think about the forms of oppression that we are witnessing in or participating in, right? And then trying to think about how we would apply this model to try to shift those oppressive systems. All right? So she's thinking about change. She's also thinking about interdependence as another core principle. And what I think she means by interdependence is that change is only possible through collaboration. That competition, thinking that there is always an enemy that we must defeat, that it's always going to be us versus someone, is an enemy of change, right? Because it is always going to bring us back to a certain status quo, right? And that it is only through connecting to each other, through collaborating with each other, that we are going to start to move away from systems where someone is always being harmed. Okay? And then I think go ahead.
Can I,
Sure.
I want someone to put a little meat on that bone
Yeah.
and explain what that means. Yeah? So, in other words, let's say we're talking about an anti-racist movement. Yeah? What should my relationship be as a black man to whites if I'm invested in an anti-racist movement?
Collaborative.
What do you mean?
So if it's anti-racist, collaborating all races together and being, coming together to do something together.
Okay, so you want me to call up Steve King and Donald Trump and say, hey, we have a shared project. I am using Steve King because he famously last week was talking about white supremacy, right? Why is that a bad
What's
word?
so wrong with white
right?
supremacy?
What's so wrong with that? I'm using Donald Trump because of his announcement about Mexicans and da-da-da-da and blacks in hellholes, right? So like the most overt, right? I'm using that. So, because you didn't make any like limitations, right? On a vision. You just said it should be collaborative.
Correct.
Okay, so how can I be black, anti-racist, and collaborating with the staunch, like, you know, white supremacist in this case? I saw your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this really pertains to your second question, but I was thinking more about how, like, in a lot of feminist movements right now, there's, like, a bit of backlash about, like, white feminists, like, not creating space for, like, queer feminists or, like, feminists of color, and about how, like, as a feminist community, we all need to work together to, like, create space for, like, for all women and, like, for all people, and not, like, just, like, white feminists fighting for, like, white female power and stuff like that.
Okay, so what does space for all, I can understand space for all women, because presumably, my thinking is, what you're talking about is women don't have power and or are subordinated in some way right now. Okay, cool. I am not a woman, right? I'm not a cis woman, and I don't identify as a woman, right? Okay, so what place do I have in your movement? Let's say you work out your differences between white women and women of color. Does that just mean that you now have more power and more organization to come and fight me?
No, okay, well...
Should I be wary of your unity?
No, because feminism isn't, like, just for women. Like, everyone should be a feminist because it's just the equality of all sexes. It's not like women need to, like, make more space for just women. It's just creating equal space for all, like, genders and
So
sexes.
what does that look like for me?
So, like, I would have the same opportunities that you would have regardless of, like, gender or sex or, like, race or anything like that.
In my department, men make more than women. That's
Yeah.
actually true.
Yeah.
So what are you proposing? You're saying I should take a pay cut?
Yeah, actually, in that case, probably. Or, like,
Sign me up.
the difference of your pay cut and the pay cut of the women in your department. Or, like, make pay based on, like, the actual ability to, like, do a job well, which I know there's, like, problems with, like, standardized testing being, like, not, like, actually, like, even because, like...
Sell me your vision as something other than pain. That's the thing I'm trying to am I... Okay.
That's great. Yeah.
Right. So here, because your vision on the one, no matter what we're talking about, right? It sounds like pain. If I'm Steve King and the people of color come together and condemn white supremacy, and even if our white allies join us and we condemn white supremacy, this is pain to Steve King. If all the women come together and demand their power, and the only thing you can offer me as a cis man is a pay cut, that sounds like pain. Yeah? All right, so give me your vision, because this is the thing that Professor Berry was talking about, right? Like a vision around something that is that doesn't reduce to confrontation, right? Doesn't reduce to opposition. Do you have such a vision? Can you articulate that? Especially since even in your vision of equality, which sounds like the answer, right? We're all together in equality. I'm not starting from the bottom in the sex game, right? I'm starting from the top. So equality don't sound good. Yeah? Okay. So now deal with the problem.
Maybe we can let somebody who hasn't had a chance to talk. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I'm taking one class right now. It's on the foundations of community. It's philosophy, and the main text that we're reading, it calls for this need for the otherness in someone, and that we don't form community based on what we have in common, and we don't, because when you have that, you create an us versus them complex, which then power structures of inequality. Rather, when you encounter the stranger or the other, something in them you lack, and you find completion in their otherness, and you build a community off of that. And that is kind of how shaping my perspective when, you know, I want to, like, I'm gay. I want to take down, like, people who can't tell me, like, that I can get married this weekend and get fired on Monday because we don't have a non-discrimination act in PA. Like, I want to, like, sue and get court for that. But what I really want is not tolerance before the law. I want acceptance by my peers. So I want to acknowledge those who say that I've challenged a religious faith. To look me in the eye like I am a Christian as well, but I'm another type of Christian. I complete you. We have a fuller idea of what community can look like together. That's how I see less of like this pushback of us versus them, let's see who can outcompete and win, because that's never going to settle anything. I think we have to see the other to really find full completion.
Yeah.
I have places I would go, but go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, what do you say?
So, with regards to confrontation, I don't know how you could not confront if there's overtly bigoted or racist things. I don't know how you would not confront that as seeing it as problematic and non-confrontational. I feel like that is requiring confrontation.
When you say, and I think a lot of people, different people could interpret Adrienne Marie Brown's theory differently. My interpretation is that it's actually not non-confrontational, but that it is thinking about building a world that is a non-enemy universe, is the language that she uses. That we are trying to move towards a place where, in order for me to succeed, Professor Bracey doesn't have to fail, right? That my success is tied up in Professor Bracey's success. I am happy when Professor Bracey is also happy, right? But it doesn't mean that one of the strategies to get there might be confrontational, right? That might be the best way to move us forward in a moment. I think she would encourage us to say, maybe it's not just confrontation. Maybe that's not the only tool that we have at our disposal, right? And trying to think as creatively as possible about how we're building with each other. Yeah.
I think maybe the reason why it's harder to answer the question when it's not, well, feminists should work together, and it's more, well, how should feminists work with men, or how should they, or how should someone who's part of the anti-racist movement work with white people? Because I think it's a little idealist that for a world to work like that, where everybody views the benefit as other people as essential for their own benefit, I think you'd have to get everybody to be okay with sacrificing part of their identity. And that's the reason why, even as ideal as it would be even for someone who is gay to talk to somebody who's very religious, there's not really a realistic benefit in in the mind of the person who's religious, because for them, what are they gaining?
So let me push you, because I'm trying to bring an idea up, right? So let me push you, right? In the sense that you're saying identity is built on confrontation, and for that reason we can't get out of the game of confrontation. Yeah. At which point, I would ask you about your relationship with your siblings. Do you have siblings?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And do you see your success as dependent on your siblings' failure?
No.
Do you believe that your parents' love for you is conditioned on them hating your siblings?
No.
Are you prepared to fight your siblings for every inch of your inheritance?
No. But
No. So what I'm saying is you have an identity in which your good and your siblings' good are tied up together. Yeah? And is there a way that we can create a structure in the way that we've created a family as a structure in which there's not that kind of competition? Is there a way that we could do that on different levels and in different planes?
it kind of doesn't work in this situation, because with siblings, we're all on the same playing field. Our parents are the same. We were all given the same chances with the same parent, you know. And it would be different though if I, as one child, was automatically preferenced. Why would I have any reason to want to give up anything to them?
I think the point here is that it's construction, right? Oh, sorry, Ms. Park.
Yeah, I think the reason I'm so conflicted in my head is because I feel like there's always a greater enemy in general. So like in the case of the feminist movement, like if you're a woman in the workplace, and let's say there's a male who's making more than you, you would think that why would it be beneficial for the male to give up their status or whatever they have in order to make sure that the woman also is in the work field. But what they don't understand like is the bigger enemy itself might be their pay or their company in general. If you have a bigger or broader like more people supporting you, it could be through differences. But if you have more people in general, you're gaining, whether that be money or resources, you'll be gaining it regardless. And having everyone in that dialogue is always going to be more beneficial to you. So So like I'm contradicting myself in one way because then what is the final enemy then? Like
Mhm.
if everyone
Mhm.
comes together
Mhm.
like, is the enemy of like mankind itself. So I feel like you just have to be aware that even if you think someone's against you, overall you have to come together to fight a bigger enemy. And that bigger enemy is always changing, if that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think is part of what you're saying that in order for us to feel connected to each other, we have to be united against something?
Sort
Okay.
of, in a way.
Uh-huh.
And that final enemy is kind of what's like kind of
Yeah.
confusing for me or a little bit blurred.
Yeah. I mean, I gotta say, the concept of a non-enemy universe is incredibly difficult for me for a million reasons. And one of them is I love having enemies, right? That's why I went to law school. I was like, I want to fight somebody, and I want to have some power to do it, right? And it's all of the training that I have gotten to be an attorney has taught me that to be good at my job and to help people, I have to find enemies and I have to go to battle against them, right? So this concept is I find very challenging, and again, it's not the only vision of how to move us forward, but I think the third principle that she puts out that does, I think, try to address this is the idea of transformation, and the idea that we have to be thinking about change intergenerationally. So thinking about what would need to change for 1 or 2 or 10 generations from now to be in a different position. And I think, did anybody go to the lecture last night that Dr. Kendi gave? Yeah. And so when he talked about the abolitionists who first demanded immediate emancipation and how everyone said, you're bonkers, that is never going to happen, right? When Dr. King, when Reverend King came out and in opposition to the Vietnam War, right? How just universally outraged people were and thinking that was impossible. We would never see that, right? These are some examples of trying to think intergenerationally. And I mean, really, I was thinking about this about Diane Nash's lecture last year when she talked about her and other organizers signing their wills before they got on the bus to go south on a freedom ride. What is more transformational and intergenerational than saying, I'm willing to die for this. I'm willing to give up my own life so that future people will not have to suffer in the same way, right? So I think this concept embraces this idea that it is so difficult in this present moment to imagine a universe where we're not constantly fighting an enemy, and that is one of the things that we should be trying to change. Yeah.
I'm curious, like with either of your experiences, like with sort of movements, how do you
Uh-huh.
frame like your members to put 2 generations before, like ahead of you, like that
Uh-huh.
needs to change then and not now?
Mhm.
Like how, like is there burnout in that? Just like, oh, I'm not gonna see change now, so how do you navigate that?
Sure. I mean, I can
I
respond to
can
that.
if you want.
Yeah.
You can.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay. So, I mean, I can tell you, when I went to law school, I really went to law school with this idea that I wanted to help people who were being oppressed, and that to do that, I needed power. So I wanted to go to law school and get that law degree so that when I walked into a courtroom, someone would listen to me and I could stand up and fight for someone who was suffering some kind of harm, right? And I thought that the law was going to be this tool that I could use to do that. So I went to law school. I hated it, by the way. I'm really glad I went. I hated law school. I got through it. I graduated. I got a fellowship. I got a great job doing exactly what I wanted to do, which was helping people fight for their right to remain in their community, people who are facing deportation. And I did that job for a number of years with a nonprofit legal aid organization. And after a year of doing this, then another year doing this, and another year doing this, I started to realize we were just cycling people in and out of this system, and that the same thing was happening over and over and over again. And you would go to court the next day and the same thing would happen. You go to court the next day and the same thing would happen. And I started looking around and thinking, am I actually helping anyone? Or am I just propping up this system that is destroying people's lives, right? And so I started to get involved with some of the community organizations in Philadelphia who were working in immigrant communities and who were putting out strategies that were not just about going to court, that were not just about seeking legal solutions, that may have been a part of the strategy, and it was a lot of the time, but the strategy was so much broader, not just in tools, but also in time. And one of the organizations that I began working with was an organization based in the refugee community, working with folks who had been resettled as refugees from Southeast Asia, primarily from Cambodia, but also from Vietnam and Laos in Philadelphia. And many folks who had come to the United States as refugees were now facing deportation back to the country that they had been forced out of, largely due to US military policy. And when I started working with this organization, one of the first workshops I went to, they talked about intergenerational trauma and how folks whose parents had been refugees, who had witnessed genocide, who had witnessed atrocities, had passed on some of that terror to their children in a whole range of different ways. And they were thinking about how to try to break the cycle of trauma, right? So it wasn't me who had to bring this idea into that room, right? It was me who had to learn it. And this is sort of how I started to come to some of these ideas, and recognizing that the law is most frequently an obstacle to change. It is most frequently used to criminalize, to tear families apart, to prevent change from happening, to overturn a policy that would have created an opportunity to change, right, than it is to liberate people. And I started to understand that unless I was working as part of a broader strategy that was led by the people who themselves had experienced the problem, I wasn't going to feel like I was contributing to anything. So that is how I came to this. So I think, just going back to your question of how do you sell this to, the organizers came up with this idea. They generated this. We are the ones that need to receive it, right? And I think I had some examples that I was going to put up, which I'd be happy to share with folks over email. But one of the most inspiring examples I've seen of this is an organization. They're based out in California in the Bay, called Generation 5. I don't know if you've come across them at all. Yeah? Do you want to share?
I literally refer a wiki about sometimes. That's
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Generation 5 is an organization that's trying to end sexual assault of children. And the approach that they are taking is that it is going to take at least 5 generations for us to dismantle our ideas about children and sex. And so the first generation, the target, is actually just to shift consciousness, to change ideas. Second generation is going to focus on policy and legal reform. But they don't actually think we can get there until we have been able to change our ideas and really question where a lot of these ideas come from. And they have a 5-generation plan, and it literally goes into like 2085, right? So thinking about their great-grandchildren, right? So I think there are a lot of organizations that are embracing this idea, right? That is how important they think it is for us to try to create some of these changes, is to not actually be able to see them in their lifetime. Yeah.
The best, oh, sorry, what were you gonna say? Mm-hmm. Honestly, I think it's this has never been a question for me because I came up in Black church, right? And so, like, in Black church, it's always been generational. Like, this collective memory is strong, right? The effort to do for future generations is the point. And the best way to get kicked out of the Black community is to be about yourself today, right? Because yourself today will always be benefited by selling out, right? And so it's like the most basic ethic. But I would say, if I, like, the things that I've drawn from, if you saw Planet of the Apes, the most recent one, this is weird, but true. All right. If you saw the most recent one, anybody see the most recent one?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, you saw it? All right. You don't need to see it if you've read Exodus, okay? And the reason why you don't need to see it if you've read Exodus, because it literally is the Exodus story. And if you remember, Moses is leading the people out of Israel, right? They're caught up in the desert. Moses strikes the rock and he's about to lead the people in. And although they have been like these like awful people the whole time in part, Moses is like, you guys get to go and I don't get to go, right? And we praise Moses, who never actually entered the promised land. Same thing happens in the movie. The leader doesn't enter the promised land. MLK's last speech is him, I won't get there with you, right? Like this is a constant refrain in all movements. And so it doesn't, it's so embedded in the ethic of the people and in movements that it's not something I've ever felt the need to have to do anything but draw from. Yeah, I mean, does that strike you as?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking like, how do you get people, like, how do you get like a huge group to like have that mentality? So I don't know if like
So
I'm
I'm-
asking like the right
Yeah.
way. But
I think people do have that mentality. I just
Yeah.
think it depends on what they want to change. And I actually was thinking about this after the talk last night, and one of the things that I thought was, there were a lot of things that were so striking. And I gotta say, I did not agree with everything that he said last night, but there were so many brilliant things that he said, and one of them was this narrative of racist progress. So for those of you who weren't there, Professor Kendi talked about when we are looking at the history of race in America, we talk about racial progress, right? And how we've been on this arc moving towards freedom and equality. But that there has been a dual track that we don't talk about of racist progress, which, reframing the last election as a victory for the racist movement, right? And as I was going home last night, I was thinking about my own family. I just did one of those DNA tests, right? And it came back 95% Pennsylvania settler. Right, that's right, that face. Which, the language, right? The language. Which what I took from that was what I mostly already knew, which is that my family has been in Pennsylvania 4 generations, and that they came here to settle the land, meaning to displace and, I'm sure, participate in the genocide of Native folks who lived here, right? And what I was thinking about was when they came here and began working, right? They were starting to build wealth and accumulate property that would be transferred through the generations, leading up to me becoming a professor at Villanova University, right? They were thinking intergenerationally, I'm sure they wouldn't have used that language, right? But there's intergenerational thinking is happening all the time. I think it just depends on what kind of change it is you think you're working towards. Does that make sense?
And can I give
Of course.
And Will, I'm going to let you know, sorry.
Yeah.
On a practical brass tacks level, all right, way more people are against being oppressed than are against oppression. You know what I'm saying? Right? And so you can whip a large group of people up over their oppression way faster and way easier than you can over oppression, right, itself. So one would be to focus on their own harm and the harm that comes to their children, usually as a harm that they should take as personal, yeah? So like even when you hear like the hashtag #MeToo stuff, men are coming out and say, I'm against the harms of hashtag #MeToo. Why? Because I own / have a wife, daughter, etc.,
Yep.
right? So they internalize it as, I'm against being harmed by sexual assault, not I'm against sexual assault, yeah? The other brass tacks answer is people follow cults of personality. And that's not about morality or anything else. That's just practice of charisma, yeah? And if I were building out a movement, when I was building out religious groups, the number one thing was, and and this is terrible, but I will tell you. I use this example of a baby zebra. I use like weird examples all the time, all right? A baby zebra. Cute. Why a baby zebra? Because a zebra has stripes, right? The reason why a zebra has stripes is so that you can't tell one zebra apart. So that the predators can't pick one out and kill it. Yeah? So the idea is that you can't distinguish them. But that's a problem when you give birth, because it's supposed to be able to find its mother, right? And the other zebras either won't feed it or will kill it. So how do you protect this baby zebra? Answer: the zebras, when they give birth, will only allow the foal to see the mother's coat for like the first 3 hours. It doesn't see like anything else. The mother just stands right in front of it, and that's the only thing it sees, the only thing it sees, the only thing it sees. And so then it knows its mother's pattern well enough to distinguish her from the other zebras. What does that have to do with movements and cults of personality and all that sort of stuff? The answer is, if you want a big, strong movement, you have to fill up people's whole lives. You have to provide friendship, you have to provide love, homes, sex, economies, land, food, all of those types of things. Did I say food twice? And that's what makes religious groups like even more successful than most other types of movements. That's why they're willing to pay more cost. They're not paying cost for ideology in the way that most liberals ask you to pay cost for ideas. They're not paying cost for ideas. They're paying cost for their loved ones, right? It's not even that they pay cost for their gods. They pay cost for connection. And imagine what you would do for the people that you feel most connected to, yeah? I think the largest weakness in leftist movements is simply that, ironically, leftist movements don't attend to the fact that we are human beings the way that conservative movements do. That's the, like, out of practice, that's the true answer. People gotta like you. Right? You know what I'm saying? And believe that you'll care for them, and they'll do a lot.
So there's a couple different things we could do now. We could talk about some historical examples about the relationship between law and organizing and how the role that it has played or in preventing change or in bringing change, right? We could talk about some examples from the Civil Rights Movement or from other movements for Black liberation. Yeah.
Can I ask a question real quick? So with the transformation, so if you think of it intergenerationally, and Dr. Kendi last night was like talking about how you have to like think of it like now, like you have to change it now, and you can't, because you use the example of like how the white moderator is like, oh, it'll be like a gradual change, but then that's just basically keeping the system in place itself instead of progressing. So like, what was your response to?
Well, I think one of the other things that he said last night was that in order to actually change things, we need to really confront the depth of the problem, right? We need to be able to hold the history of anti-Blackness and racial oppression in the United States, right? And then we also need to still believe we can get people free, I think is the language that he used, right? So I think if we are really trying to confront the depth of the problem, that necessitates us understanding it is not going to change overnight, right? But it doesn't mean that we can't act today. And I think in this theory of change that I am embracing, or I'm trying to embrace, is how am I acting today that is consistent with the world I want to build in the future that I may not ever see.
Which is why we started with a vision. You have to have a strong vision built into yourself. Yeah, sorry, Brian.
Yeah.
Go ahead. That's great.
No,
I was gonna say, you just reminded me of the Gandhi quote, like, be the change, be the change you wish to see in the world. Also, an interesting thing that kind of ties into America, that when my wife and I on our honeymoon went up to like a 2-week tour through Canada, and I think a big thing that we realized from that, aside from the Canada's fantastic and it's just great. And my wife's African American, so that we weren't out of place in Canada, and especially when you go far up like in Quebec and stuff like that, which was really interesting. And I could talk a lot about that. But we're kind of being both historians, saying that the foundation of America versus the foundation of Canada, and how the people first interacted with people, with the indigenous people, is kind of sets the course of the country and how people are seen later. as well as the fact that once we went to Ottawa, and which is like they had their version of the Smithsonian, and they talk about all the devious crap that they've done. Like they say, this is what we did wrong. Here's how we try to change it. America's, we just are like, nope, keep your head down and pound on, and it'll get better. We don't have to ever confront the things that were the wrongs, the things that were done wrong. We figure like, well, we don't want to, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to focus on the past and things. It just holds us back. We need to look forward, but you really can't get there without, especially when you're talking about like whole peoples that have been like hurt by the systematic oppression. You can't just forget about it. It doesn't work like that in real life. Like I said, you forget that people are human, and you can't do that. So just an observation on that.
Well, it's making me think about when Brian Stevenson was here and when he talked about his travel and lectures that he had done in South Africa and going to all the different ways that folks are trying to reconcile with the history of apartheid there, right? Which I think he acknowledged have not all been successful, right? But that there is a language around it that we don't have here, right? And so the museum that he's building in Alabama, which is trying to give people an opportunity to confront, right, the history of lynching, which I think, Professor Bracey would say is not history, right? Right.
So I have a question for you all. Is it okay?
Of course.
I have a question for y'all. When y'all walked in here, well, let me put it like this. If I were you, sitting here now, I would think, what does this have to do with the law? Yeah? Okay. So then I would like for us to answer that question.
Great.
All right? And we did not discuss this particular idea, so I'm going to throw it out for Professor Berry real quickly. I would like for you to embody what you said as that the law is the obstacle. Yeah? And I'm going to embody what I assume is most of your position, that is that the law is a tool for change. Yeah? And I want to, can we do that?
Can we actually just pause for a second and ask folks to share, can you give an example of when the law has contributed to change in any direction? Maybe to just start there. Good, bad, whatever perspective you have on it. Yeah.
Well, the idea of the Bill of Rights and the formation of this country and separating from England as an independent United States.
Right, yeah.
I don't think this is really what you're looking for, but I feel like it's kind of important. But like,
Sure.
I feel like it's not so much that law creates change, but it reflects change like 5 to 10 years after it occurs.
Okay.
So an example, like I'm from Florida, so the recent law change to like allow people who went to prison to be able to vote. Like that's something that most other states have had for like a little bit longer than Florida has. And so like the law didn't actually like it created like a physical change in Florida, but it didn't create a change in mentality. Like the law became a thing because the mentality changes, and the law just was behind and like finally managed to catch up. And I feel like that's kind of like what I feel like happens with the law a lot. It's not so much like it's supposed to like show what the like nation is feeling and like keep the nation like up to date, but in reality it's always like lagging behind and creating more problems than it's really solving.
Okay. So the law restored voting rights to folks who had felony convictions, right?
Yeah, sort of. Depending on the conviction.
Right, depending on the conviction, exactly. It wasn't for everybody. What tool had been used to take away voting rights in the first place?
The law.
The law.
Yeah.
Right? Right. Yeah, go ahead.
Like the Three Strikes Act, three strikes basically, like so for like felons. And that with the whole entire like the just the drug policies that were like put into place, and then those, and like to kind of go against that, like the policies were put into place, and this was something that obviously Dr. Kim talked about last night. But the policies were put into place, and then that kind of changed the mindset of people to then look at drugs as a bad thing, or like people of color who are doing drugs or who sell them or whatever it is are then in turn bad, and then that changes the mindset of the people. So it's not necessarily like they didn't have that like in their mind until the policy was put into place itself to then create the mindset of the people.
And I might, take that a little bit further, right? It wasn't just our ideas about people who sell drugs. It was about all people of color were now assumed to be
yes.
participating
Yeah.
in crime, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about the late 80s and 90s when we came up with a lot of our mandatory sentencing laws, right? War on drugs. We call the era of the rule of law,
Yeah.
when, right, the government was creating all of these laws to criminalize certain behavior. Yeah, and then was used against particular populations, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like we should mention too that sometimes the law is not just the words, maybe like that we would read, but also with like the federal judicial appointments, district attorneys who are the chief criminal justice people that I don't like. Some people don't even know who their DA is, and the reality is like sometimes the law might read a certain way. I mean, for God's sakes, like the 14th Amendment, like for the longest time that didn't apply to the states. It was just federal level. Before, your only right as a U.S. citizen was the right to travel. Nothing else. Everything else was left to the states, and there isn't equal application of the law. And kind of how you were saying, like, philosophy buff, I love Montesquieu, like, sometimes the law doesn't catch up with us because if we put the law on a society that didn't have the social view that we might have now, there's no love for the law, so the law would not be applied because there's no authority behind it. It's there. And the reality is sometimes even when society does catch up, you might have a lifetime appointment or someone who's elected to position, like a DA for 4 years, where, you know, like, oh shit, like, that person has an interpretation of it, and you can fight, but, I mean, that they're gonna be there, like, for everyone who's pre-law here, some of the judges who are appointed will be the judges we will be fighting against when we are attorneys, and, like, that's scary to think about.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so those were all great examples, yeah.
Just some threads, if that's okay, or
Sure.
to wrap up.
No, go ahead, yeah.
Just certain things that have just stuck with me that have some responses to or threads that in this. The first one that kind of stuck and disturbed me, and I feel terrible leaving here without having this sort of address this when this part, is that right? Asked like, well, who's the final enemy? Coming from more of the psychological, spiritual, neurobiological background, I could easily say at the end of the day, it's us and our conditioned minds that are the enemy. But even past that is, what if there is the idea of having an enemy? One of the things we start out our class, like the one class I teach, it is a foundational notion of how we've evolved, and more of just the mammalian brain works at making decisions really quickly in a binary or dualistic manner. So you're always sort of defined by what you're against, or what you're not, or what's other. And so what you are has to be good because your ego wants to believe something good about itself. So projections and all kinds of tricky things play out there. And ultimately, it's sort of a non-dualistic approach to thinking, or we're looking at things with a fresh beginner's eye, is kind of a Buddhist term, a beginner's mind that allows more of a space for something else to emerge. And part of the way this generational change takes place, and this model called spiral dynamics that we talked about in the class works on this too, is that confrontation is often necessary. Like MLK is saying, hey, we try to talk to them. If we don't, then we go back and the 4 steps before nonviolent, direct action is, approach, try to negotiate. If not, go back and then self-purification. Let's work on ourselves before we act. Let's see the reactivity in ourselves, the biases in ourselves that in the religious context of language prevents us from loving another child of God, which is ultimately what is most truly there, and what our minds, sort of that loud judgment voice that we hear all the time, that's always chattering in our head and serves a purpose but isn't everything, that's an obstacle. And so this confrontation is necessary for us to, the psychologist Carl Jung says that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. So we kind of figure how things work, and we have an equilibrium, and it's only when they're really forced to change that we have to break things open again and let something else emerge. And so there's sort of greater and greater capacities of awareness that can be developed and have developed in our history as a people, as us individuals, and as a history. One of the fun Brasstacks piece in the class that we try to get to, and there's a fascinating TED Talk, it might be the most watched ever, called My Stroke of Insight, the neuroanatomist who has a stroke in her left brain. left brain sort of the seed of the logic, the me, the self, the smaller individual self. I'm not even getting into how the cultural barriers to us being able to move forward without ideas of a zero-sum game. That there's always a loser and there's always a winner, right? Our identity, if it's just me as an individual against others, well, yeah, but there's a whole other side of our brain, and this is what she goes into. It is very similar to what is experienced in practices, spiritual practices, meditations, you name it, that is a sense of the we and the broader connectedness and peace of well-being of just the present moment. And none of the baggage of our conditioning has influenced that. So literally, we are built for this future that we're hoping for and for this dream, but the confrontation is kind of necessary because the confrontation is holding up a mirror so that we're stretched further and further know what our true identity is, which is both a person and a part of a very, very big we that goes back to the Big Bang and maybe further back.
Yeah, and I think I would go back to what you're saying about where do our ideas come from about other people, right? About difference and about what the categories that we place people in. And the law is one of the sources of those ideas that we need to try to break down and disentangle if we want to move forward, right? So I just, I think your question is so important, right? And so I just want to go back to this of what does this have to do with the law? And I think you all just shared some really important examples. So I want to answer your question. I don't want to escape from it. Mostly what I still practice is deportation defense. And so I have spent a little bit of time looking at the history of our immigration laws and policies and where they come from. And the first, what we consider the first immigration law in the United States, which was a naturalization law written in 1791, was written to provide citizenship only to who? White males with property, right? No one else could claim citizenship. So it was written explicitly to prevent people who had been slaves from claiming citizenship in the United States, right? And then we think about all the different ways that the law has changed in order to preserve that racial oppression over time, right? So eventually, obviously, citizenship was opened up, but there were all sorts of different ways that they made it incredibly difficult for people of color to be able to access citizenship. So if we think about who our laws are used disproportionately against, right? It's not the undocumented Irish in Pennsylvania, of which there are 70,000, right? It is other groups, right? Yeah, right? So when we think about the role of the law and why I think the law is used more often to oppress and to criminalize, it's coming directly from my experience in practicing immigration law and trying to defend people from deportation. Am I answering your question?
You are. I think that you're everybody. We're on solid ground to be critical of the law and see the law as a problem and as an obstacle. But we are actually in a situation where we have to also know how to use the law and
Absolutely.
know what makes how that creates possibilities. Right. So it's true that the law racializes and subordinates. It's also true that the law created the openings for the freedom rides, right? It's true that the law has defined me, at one point defined me as property. It's also true that the law is the basis on which I can have property now, right?
It's also true that I mostly win my cases, right? So that people do get status, right?
Or maybe you're just good.
I am good, but also that, well, I would say the law is also set up to have some people have some people win, right? So that it makes it seem as if it's a fair system, right? Because that helps the system itself maintain legitimacy. But I do think, and I think this is another whole conversation we can have, and one of the reasons why I was really drawn to working with individuals, people need to be here tomorrow. Right? They need to access whatever benefits they need. They need to get out of jail. They need to be able to stay in their community to be able to keep fighting and moving towards a different future, right? So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I just think that even when you're in a bad situation, you have to be able to use even the things that are against you for your benefit. Right? That's all.
Yeah. Yeah. So the goal
I don't
was.
know what time we have to end.
I think we're over
That
time.
was where I
Yeah.
I meant to connect back to your point of that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the goal was not to dissuade folks from going to law school, but maybe to get you starting to think about what you're getting into, right? And being able to engage critically and have your eyes open about what that decision involves, right? Yeah? All right. Any
It sounds
other?
like what you're saying, then the law is sort of where it finally becomes concrete, and it's the slower to change, but there's a lot of things that can move that change forward prior to the law being changed. Is that your experience?
I mean, I think, you know, in my multi-generational vision, we're moving away from anything that looks like the legal system the United States currently has, right? And trying to think about what healing actually looks like, which is not what is happening in the legal system, right? No one is being made whole by participating in the American legal system, right? Right. But I do think right, that's generations and generations from now. So I do think tomorrow people are going to need support and assistance. Yeah, is that answering your question?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah? Yeah.